the meeting secretary, it's my pleasure now to introduce this evening's speaker, who is a long-standing member of the Society and a Kipling scholar of great repute. So Mark Paffard published a monograph on Kipling in 1989, Kipling's Indian Fiction. He's since then published, I think, 8 or maybe 9 articles in the Kipling Journal.
Hello, 5.6344.
I'm not sure.
But whether 8 or 9, I think, makes you one of our most prolific contributors, certainly in recent times, perhaps in the whole history of the 98-year-old journal. You might know Mark's excellent article on wireless, his articles about the Masonic stories. Most recently, his story is Mrs. Bathurst Black, so thought-provoking story from 2018. And you might no doubt know some of Mark's scholarship on Kipling, but you might not know he also wrote a historical novel about Vienna in 1812 called the Razumovsky Quartets. So look that up on Amazon. But of course, tonight, Mark has come to speak about his most recent monograph, published a few years ago, Conservative Belief and the Imagination in Kipling's Fiction. Here it is. And so without further ado, I will hand over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for inviting me back. I think Alex wasn't here, and I spoke for rather a long time because I didn't realize you'd just had an AGM, so I'll be a bit shorter tonight. So. Yes. How's that? Technology, it's, yeah. So, conservative belief and the imagination in Kipling's fiction. My preferred title for the book would actually have been The Anxious Conservative, but which I thought suited Kipling, but I was overruled. Though I did get conservatism changed to conservative belief, as I thought conservatism might be misread as conservation or something to do with conservatories. I begin by saying that the book is about the tension between Kipling's imagination and his conservative outlook. And what I imagine Kipling doing is something really familiar to anyone who's tried to write a story. That is, finding out where the story's going and or what the characters are really like in the process of writing. The reason I think this is a useful starting point for looking at Kipling's huge achievement is that he has very strong and unequivocal views on many of the topics he brings into his stories. Some of these are inherently political, like the task of governing India or the role of women in society. Others, which I see as also being part of Kipling's conservative mindset, include his emphasis on ritual and tradition, or even in some cases, the acceptance of suffering as a necessary aspect of life. In the late story Uncovenanted Mercies, which is miles away from any religious orthodoxy, suffering is even a necessary part of life after death. So what I call the tension between the conservatism and the imagination is where I think I can see the process of discovering a character or shaping a narrative, taking Kipling away from his usual unequivocal outlook, or at least modifying it in some way. During Kipling's incredibly long career, I don't think the conservative outlook changes all that much. But of course, the social and political issues do. The most important for Kipling's fiction are the governance of India in the early stories, the anxieties brought about new wealth and technological change at the beginning of the 20th century, and the impact of the First World War. The Boer War mattered to Kipling, but his fictions about it are too propagandist, for me anyway. He's perceptive about the doubts of the English middle class, but scarcely mentions the growth in the industrial working class. I have to give a few examples, and I'll start with a very early story, The Strange Ride of Morrowby Jukes. Jukes, an engineer working in the desert, falls into a crater. It has an open side, which is guarded by quicksand, the river Sutlej, and also a gunboat. In it are about 65 loathsome Hindus, including Gunga Das, an annoyingly educated Brahmin whom Jukes has known in the past. We're told that Hindus recover after being thought dead have to be confined here, which is pure invention on Kipling's part. I think you can all hear me. Is everybody in the virtual world okay? Yeah, seem to be good. Right. So the context for this story is the experience of the white Anglo-Indian in India. In all his writing from this early period, Kipling's on the side of conservative Anglo-Indians who believe that the natives are both childlike and untrustworthy. They oppose giving Indians positions of responsibility. The horrors of the rebellion or mutiny of 1857 are still recalled. So the story is an Anglo-Indian nightmare as Jukes loses all his authority and is forced to eat crow with the Hindus. But where Kipling's imagination makes a huge difference is in his portrayal of Jukes. The story begins with Jukes making a mistake. He wants to get rid of the dogs whose noise is tormenting him, but when he shoots one and hangs it up, of course he makes things worse. Chasing another dog, he falls into the crater. He wants to both control his environment and keep it at arm's length. Numerous clues in the story, like the scar on Das's cheek, tell us that Jukes is prone to bursts of self-righteous anger. He himself says with pride that he lacks imagination. For Kipling to create an Anglo-Indian character and an engineer as unsympathetic as Jukes comes as a real surprise, because in most of his stories about Anglo-Indian civilians, they are portrayed as unsung heroes. I think that what lies behind it here is an uncertainty about how best to govern India. In his Indian work, Kipling often explores ways to know Indians better, a process that leads eventually to Kim. But too great an intimacy can lead to disaster, as for example in The Man Who Would Be King. Of the attitudes, let the white go to the white, as Kipling says in another context. If we think of Jukes's world as a microcosm of India, Jukes has learned nothing and could easily repeat his mistakes. Distance and closeness are both problematic. Kipling's discovery of Jukes's character in the process of writing creates a much more interesting and paradoxical story. In his autobiography, Kipling speaks of how the cards were dealt to him. Others may think that genius creates its own luck. To me, it feels fortunate that for a period in the 1890s, Kipling was a little more detached from politics with the large P than he had been in India or would be in England, because this is when he first became a writer for children. There are the Jungle Books, written from the relative seclusion of his short-lived home in Vermont. But the following years also produced Captains Courageous and Storky & Co. Then the first decade of the 20th century produced Kim, The Just So Stories, Puck of Pook's Hill, and Rewards and Fairies. So that in about 15 years, he actually wrote far more for children than he did for adults. Of course, though, this is half the story. Kipling wrote of Rewards and Fairies that the tales had to be read by children before people realized that they were meant for adults. And that is something that has at least some application to all his writing for children. The tension between his conservative outlook and his imagination operates in quite a range of ways here. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but here are some brief examples. The Jungle Books clearly promotes the importance of traditions and obedience to a strong leader, Akela. I think the tales are so alive, though, not only because of the descriptive brilliance, but because there are other contradictory ideas. For example, Mowgli seems to be an example of Rousseau's contention that society corrupts what he calls the noble savage. though the corrupt nature of the local village is also a satire on Indian peasants, not the white men who are known to be just. On the other hand, the delight that the animals take in their own animal nature, but also their lack of reasoning power, since even Kaa and Hathi can only infer things from their own limited experience, is in indirect contrast to Mowgli's abilities as he grows. Since Courageous ends by celebrating the entrepreneurial drive of Mr. Chain and the reformed Harvey as his successor, but it's the idiosyncratic community of fishermen, especially those on board the We're Here, that stick in the mind. In a similar way, and in Storky & Co., Kipling's overt message that the education of boys like Storky will benefit the empire, comes up against some contradictions. One of which is that for me, Beetle, who of course was Kipling, it's Beetle, not Storky, who's the real hero of the book. To take a rather different example, the Tree of Justice in Rewards and Fairies looks at issues of might versus right. Kipling imagines that the Saxon King Harold did not die at Hastings, but is still alive. Though frail and powerless, he inspires loyalty at his moment of death and rejects the Norman accusation that he broke his oath. England is now ruled by the Norman king Henry I, but the story is not unsympathetic to Henry's need to consolidate his own power in order to govern effectively. The difficult truth presented is that of Thomas Hobbes, that it is better to obey whoever is sovereign than have anarchy. It was a difficult truth for Kipling because when he wrote the story, a detested liberal government had come to power and censured a friend from the Boer War, Lord Alfred Milner. I have no doubt that Kipling's own sense of powerlessness and defeat feeds into a very dark story, written for children, but also meant for adults. I'm going to jump forward a few decades now. The horrors of World War I produced four of Kipling's greatest stories: Mary Postgate, The Gardener, The Janeites, and A Madonna of the Trenches. In The Gardener, I think that Kipling is in almost total sympathy with Helen Turrell, the well-to-do woman who has lost a son in the war. Almost, but not quite. There is no criticism of Helen for her son Michael's illegitimacy, or of her pretense that he is her adopted nephew. Kipling shows us the depth of her love and her self-control. We also completely understand her distaste at being manufactured into a bereaved next of kin by the bureaucracy. Yet to me, Helen doesn't come off very well in her encounter with Mrs. Scarsworth, the lower-class woman who also has a secret. Helen tries but fails to give the other woman a sympathetic response. And at the end, when the young man in the war cemetery speaks to her of her son, not her nephew, Helen doesn't understand. As Mary Magdalene does in John's Gospel, she supposes Jesus to be the gardener. But unlike Mary, she goes away without realizing her mistake. The conservative outlook, if I can even call it that, lies in Kipling's admiration for Helen's upper-class resourcefulness and self-control. But her pretense, which costs her such an effort, seems at the end to be something she can never let go. The aspect of the story here that I feel Kipling discovers as he writes is the subtle portrayal of class difference and the possibility that Helen's social superiority may actually involve a disabling repression of her feelings. Repression is much more obviously an aspect of Mary Postgate's character. Kipling's later work contains a striking number of complex women characters. Helen and Mary, Miss Florence in They, Moira Sitchliff in The Dog Hervey, and of course Grace Ashcroft in The Wish House. None of them are really at ease with themselves, And in the period from 1900 up to the Great War, there are many stories where the social structures also feel strained and ill at ease. The England that Kipling settled in was not as secure as he could have wished, or as it usually appears to be in the Puck books. Turning to the war again, Kipling's faith in ritual and tradition are very evident in the Janeites and A Madonna of the Trenches. In both stories, Kipling deals sympathetically with what was a difficult subject at the time, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. In both these stories, I think we also see the ritual represented by the Masonic Lodge, trying but ultimately failing to really help the young men damaged by the war. The description of a taxi collision is used with beautiful indirection to describe the psychological damage to Humberstall in the Janeites. Every bolt and screw and nut on the chassis strained, but nothing carried away, and not a scratch on the body. I don't believe that showing the limitations of ritual was Kipling's original plan, certainly judging by the first Masonic story, In the Interests of the Brethren. But I think that sheer honesty took over. The damage done by the war was irreparable. Real imagination is closer to truth than fantasy, and all the stories I'm discussing have what Joseph Conrad called that glimpse of truth. I have tried to give a glimpse of my approach to Kipling's fiction in all its variety. I hope that approach doesn't sound too reductive. I hope that, indirectly at least, considering the whole range of Kipling's fiction also shows us Kipling the craftsman and Kipling the prose laureate. Behind his unique voice lies his enormous reading. Besides all the writers he actually quotes, I contend that he had read Joyce's Dubliners and that he shows a deep appreciation of Thomas Hardy, both in the use of landscape and especially in The Wish House, in his understanding of the rural working class. In The Crater of Morrowby Jukes, there is an echo of Dante's Marsh of Styx, where angry sinners tear at each other. His prose style can astonish at any period, but I think it does generally evolve from its early brilliance to becoming more fluid and restrained. However, there are so many opening paragraphs throughout his career which are absolute tour de force, and yet always integral to follows. Stories as varied as Love of Women, They, The Wish House, and The Manner of Men. And as I don't really know how to finish this talk, I'm going to read out another beautiful little passage. The bushes rustled a little in the thicket, and Father Wolf dropped with his haunches under him, ready for his leap. Then, if you had been watching, you would have seen the most wonderful thing in the world. The wolf checked in mid-spring. He made his bound before he saw what it was he was jumping at, and then he tried to stop himself. The result was that he shot up straight into the air for 4 or 5 feet, landing almost where he left ground. Man, he snapped. A man's cub. Look. Directly in front of him, holding on by a low branch, stood a naked brown baby who could just walk, as soft and dimpled an atom as ever came to a wolf's cave at night. He looked up into Father Wolf's face and laughed. And I'll finish there. Thank you.